The brass doorknob felt cold against Ella's palm, but that wasn't what made her pause. It was the vibration. A tiny, almost invisible hum that traveled up her arm and settled right behind her teeth. She stood there for one long moment, forehead pressed against the wood of the chipped blue door, and just listened. The street behind her was quiet. It was 6:14 in the morning on a Tuesday, October 12th, too early for the neighborhood kids to be out, too late for the party crowd to still be stumbling home. Just the soft hum of the U-Haul truck idling at the curb, its orange taillights glowing in the grey dawn light. Ella turned the key one last time. The lock clicked into place with a sound that felt heavier than it should have. She slipped the key into her jacket pocket, right next to the folded cash she'd been saving for 2 years. $3,400. Enough for a fresh start. Enough to get her to the homestead in Durango she'd found online, the one with the collapsed windmill and the roof that needed patching. The listing had called it a fixer-upper with potential. Ella called it salvation. She walked down the cracked concrete path toward the truck, her boots scuffing against fallen leaves. The air smelled like wet pavement and someone's would smoke from a chimney 2 blocks over. Normal sounds. Normal smells. A dog barked somewhere. A garbage truck rumbled in the distance. All the ordinary pieces of a Wednesday morning that wasn't ordinary at all. The U-Haul held everything she owned. A mattress. 3 boxes of kitchen supplies. 2 lamps from her grandmother. A blue armchair with a cigarette burn on one arm. Clothes stuffed into garbage bags because she'd run out of boxes. It wasn't much. But it was hers, all of it earned with her own 2 hands, and that meant something. She climbed into the driver's seat and rested her forehead against the steering wheel for just a moment. The vinyl was cold. Her hands were shaking. She told herself it was just the temperature. When she looked up, her eyes went straight to the rearview mirror. And that's when she saw it. 2 blocks up, parked under the flickering streetlight that had been broken since August, sat a Ford. 70s model, faded blue, with a dent in the passenger door. She'd noticed it yesterday when she was loading the last boxes. And the day before that, when she'd come back from returning her library books. Her mouth went dry. She tasted something metallic, like she'd bitten her cheek without realizing it. She hadn't. The taste was fear, plain and simple, and she knew it well enough to recognize it by now. "You're nobody now," she whispered to her reflection. The woman in the mirror looked tired. Dark circles under brown eyes. Hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. 36 years old and starting over with nothing but a truck full of thrift store furniture and a dream about a homestead she'd never seen in person. She turned the key. The engine rumbled to life. She pulled away from the curb without looking back at the apartment, the chipped blue door, the life she was leaving behind. She didn't need to look. She'd spent the last 6 months memorizing every detail so she'd never forget what she was escaping. The highway entrance was 3 miles away. She took the back roads, the ones that wound through the older part of town where the trees arched overhead and the speed limit dropped to 25. It added 10 minutes to her trip. She didn't care. She needed to see if the Ford would follow. It did. 3 cars back. Keeping its distance. Never close enough to be obvious. Never far enough to disappear. Ella's legs started bouncing, that old nervous habit she'd never been able to break. Her right hand gripped the gear shift so hard her knuckles went white. The other hand stayed on the wheel at 10 and 2, just like her father had taught her 20 years ago in a different truck, a different life. The highway on-ramp curved ahead. She signaled. She checked her blind spot. She merged into the slow lane doing 45, earning a honk from a semi that had to slow down. She didn't apologize. She just watched the mirror. The Ford merged too. Still 3 cars back. Still patient. Still there. Ella's stomach dropped. She pressed her foot harder on the gas, feeling the U-Haul protest as the speedometer crept up to 55, then 60. The truck wasn't built for speed. It was built for moving boxes and furniture, for helping college kids get to dorms and families get to new houses. Not for escape. Definitely not for escape. But here she was anyway. Escaping. Fleeing. running toward a homestead she'd never seen because staying in the place she knew meant staying in danger. She reached for the coffee she'd bought at the gas station 2 hours ago. Cold. Bitter. She drank it anyway because it gave her hands something to do besides shake. The Ford stayed. Mile after mile. Past the outlet malls with their giant signs advertising sales she couldn't afford. Past the industrial parks with their chain-link fences and barking dogs. Past the last gas station before the interstate stretched out into farmland, flat and open and terrifying because there was nowhere to hide. Ella thought about pulling over. Thought about calling someone. But who do you call when the person following you hasn't done anything wrong except exist in your peripheral vision for 3 days? The police would ask questions she couldn't answer. They'd want explanations she couldn't give. They'd dig into her past and find the parts she'd spent years trying to bury. So she drove. The sun climbed higher. The clock on the dashboard hit 8:47 a.m. She'd been on the road for 2.5 hours and the Ford was still there, still patient, still 3 cars back like it had all the time in the world. She passed a sign that said Durango 487 miles and felt something loosen in her chest. 487 miles. 7 hours if traffic stayed light. 7 hours to figure out what came next. The Ford changed lanes. Still 3 cars back. Ella reached into her duffel bag on the passenger seat, fingers searching until they found what they needed. The hunting knife was cold against her skin, heavier than it looked in stores. She'd bought it last week at a pawn shop, paid cash, told the man behind the counter she was going camping. He'd believed her. Why wouldn't he? She looked like the kind of woman who went camping. Ordinary. Unremarkable. Forgettable. That was the thing about being nobody. People didn't look twice. They didn't remember your face or your name or the fact that you'd been living in the same apartment for 3 years without ever once having a visitor. They just saw a woman in her mid-30s with tired eyes and moved on. The knife stayed on the passenger seat, tucked under a fast food bag where no one driving past could see it. Just in case. Just in case the Ford got closer. Just in case patience ran out. A semi passed her on the left, its wake shaking the U-Haul hard enough to rattle her teeth. She gripped the wheel tighter and watched the Ford in her mirror, watching it watch her, watching it wait. She didn't know who was driving. Didn't know what they wanted. Didn't know if they were connected to him or to the money or to any of the other pieces of her life she tried to leave behind in the dark. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. They weren't going to stop. And neither was she. Not until she reached that homestead with the collapsed windmill and the chipped blue door that didn't exist yet. Not until she'd put enough miles between herself and the past that the Ford finally gave up and turned around. 482 miles to go. The Ford stayed 3 cars back. And Ella kept driving. The engine made a sound it hadn't made before. A kind of wheeze, like it was tired of running and wanted to let Ella know. She'd been driving for 12 hours straight. 12 hours with only 2 stops for gas and 1 for a bathroom break, so quick she'd practically run inside and run back out. Her hands had been on the wheel so long they felt like they'd mold to the shape of it. When she finally loosened her grip to shake out the stiffness, her knuckles cracked. 3 of them in a row, pop, 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 loud in the quiet cab of the truck. The sun was starting to think about setting. Late afternoon light painted everything golden orange, the kind of beautiful you see in postcards but never in real life. Ella didn't notice the beauty. She was too busy watching her mirrors. The Ford was gone. It had disappeared somewhere around the Nebraska border, right after that rest stop where she'd bought stale pretzels and a bottle of water that tasted like plastic. She'd come out of the bathroom and there it wasn't. Just empty highway behind her and open road ahead. She should have felt relief. She didn't. Because now there was a pickup truck with a cracked windshield. Dusty blue, maybe 50 feet behind her. It had been there for the last 50 miles. Not close enough to be threatening. Not far enough to be coincidence. Ella's neck felt like someone had replaced her muscles with iron rods. She rolled her head side to side, trying to work out the knots, but nothing helped. The tension had settled in too deep. It was part of her now, like breathing or blinking. The homestead was close. She could feel it in the way the land changed, opening up into bigger skies and emptier spaces. Fewer cars on the road. Fewer signs of life. Just miles of nothing and then more nothing after that. Her original plan had been to stop in town first. Durango proper, with its stores and people and safety in numbers. She'd mapped it out weeks ago. Get a hotel room. Take a hot shower. Eat something that wasn't gas station food. Then drive out to the homestead in the morning when the sun was up and the world felt less scary. That was before the pickup truck with the cracked windshield. That was before she understood that safety in numbers only worked if the numbers weren't all on the other side. She made the choice at the last second. The turnoff for the homestead appeared on her right. Just a dirt road really, barely wide enough for the U-Haul. No sign marking it. No indication that it led anywhere at all. The GPS had told her about it earlier, mentioned it as a landmark more than an actual road. Ella cranked the wheel hard. The truck lurched and bounced, protesting the sudden move. Behind her, she saw the pickup truck continue straight, following the main road toward town. Her heart hammered. Her hand shook. But she kept driving, deeper into the dirt road, deeper into nowhere. The homestead appeared slowly, piece by piece. First the collapsed windmill, its blades broken and still, like a bird that forgot how to fly. Then the outbuilding, a tiny shack with a roof that sagged in the middle. And finally the house itself. Small. Weathered. The kind of place that had seen 100 winters and expected to see 100 more. But something was wrong. The front door hung open. Not broken open. Not forced. Just open, swinging gently in the breeze like someone had walked through it recently and hadn't bothered to close it behind them. Ella killed the engine. The sudden silence was louder than the engine had been. She sat there for a long moment, listening to her own breathing, listening to her own heartbeat, listening for anything else. Nothing. Just wind. Just the creak of the door swinging on its hinges. Just the settling sounds of a house that had been empty too long. She reached into her duffel bag. Her fingers found the knife, still cold, still heavy. She pulled it out and held it in her lap, watching the open door like it might move, might speak, might do something other than swing. The dust on the road behind her hadn't settled yet. It hung in the air, a pale cloud that marked her arrival for anyone who might be watching. Anyone who might be waiting. She should wait for help. She should turn around and drive back to town and call someone. The real estate agent, maybe. Or the sheriff. Someone official who would know what to do about an open door on a property that was supposed to be abandoned. But the sun was sinking fast now. The gold light had turned orange, then red, then purple at the edges. Dark would come soon, and with it, the kind of cold that settles into your bones and stays there. Ella got out of the truck. Her boots hit the dirt with a soft thud. The sound echoed in the emptiness, louder than it should have been. She walked toward the house, knife in one hand, the other hand empty and shaking. The door creaked as she pushed it wider. Inside, shadows gathered in corners. Dust motes danced in the last light coming through the windows. A single room, mostly empty. A fireplace that hadn't been used in years. Floorboards that groaned under her weight. And on the table, a map. Fresh. Folded. Marked with lines. Ella's blood turned to ice. She picked it up with trembling fingers. Her old apartment was circled in red ink. Her street. Her building. Her door. And then a line drawn straight across the map, following the exact route she'd driven, ending here. Right here. At this homestead she'd never told anyone about. Next to the map, on the floor, a cigarette butt. Still slightly warm when she touched it. Someone had been here. Recently. Hours, maybe. They'd stood at this table, looking at this map, tracing the line that led from her old life to this new one. They'd smoked a cigarette while they waited. And then they'd left the door open behind them. For her. They'd left it open for her. Ella's stomach turned. She tasted bile, sharp and bitter. She dropped the cigarette butt and stumbled backward, her shoulders hitting the wall, her feet sliding on the dusty floor. The knife shook in her hand. Outside, the wind picked up. The door swung wider, then banged against the wall, then swung again, banging, swinging, banging, like someone knocking, like someone asking to come in. Ella pressed herself against the wall and tried to remember how to breathe. The map lay on the floor where she dropped it. The red line stared up at her, marking the path she'd taken, marking the place she'd ended up, marking everything she tried so hard to leave behind. She wasn't alone. She'd never been alone. They'd known where she was going before she knew herself. And now she was here, in the middle of nowhere, with night falling fast and no one coming to help. The door banged again. Ella slid down the wall until she was sitting on the floor, back against the wood, knife in her hand, eyes on the darkness gathering outside. She whispered the same words she'd whispered that morning, but they sounded different now. Smaller. More like a question than a statement. You're nobody now. The darkness didn't answer, but somewhere outside, not too far away, an engine started. Then stopped. Then started again. Waiting. Like everything else. Just waiting. The dust on the floorboards tasted like everything Ella had been running from. Dry and old and forgotten. It mixed with the bile rising in her throat, creating a flavor she knew she'd remember for the rest of her life, however long that turned out to be. She'd picked up the map again. She couldn't help herself. Her eyes kept going back to that red line, traced from her old apartment all the way here. To this room. To this moment. $347,000. The number appeared in her mind like someone had written it on the wall. $347,000 that didn't belong to her. Money she'd found in the bottom of his closet, stuffed into a duffel bag just like the one she'd packed. Money she'd taken because running empty-handed felt like dying for nothing. She'd told herself it was survival. Told herself she deserved it after everything he'd put her through. Told herself 100 lies that sounded true in daylight but crumbled in the dark. Night had fallen completely now. Ella sat in the darkest corner of the single room, her back pressed against the rough wood walls, her knees drawn up to her chest. The knife rested in her lap, but her hand had stopped shaking. That scared her more than the shaking had. The moon hadn't risen yet. Through the cracks in the wall, she could see nothing but black. No stars. No lights. Just the kind of darkness that feels alive, like it's watching you right back. Every few minutes, the house made a sound. A creak. A groan. A settling of old wood that had been standing for decades. Each time, Ella's heart stopped. Each time, she had to remind herself how to start it again. They were out there. She knew it the same way animals know when a storm is coming. Not through evidence or proof, but through something deeper. Something primal that lived in the oldest parts of her brain. The engine she'd heard earlier had gone silent. That was worse somehow. At least when it was running, she knew where they were. Now they could be anywhere. Closer. Waiting. Watching the same darkness she was watching. Her mind drifted back. Not by choice, but by force. The kind of memories that come for you when you're too tired to fight them off. She saw his face. Danny. The man she'd loved for 2 years, or thought she'd loved, or wanted to love. The man who'd been charming and funny and attentive until the day he wasn't. The man who'd hit her for the first time on a Tuesday, then cried about it on Wednesday, then bought her flowers on Thursday like flowers could fix anything. She'd stayed for 6 months after that first hit. 6 months of walking on eggshells. 6 months of learning to read his moods like a weather forecast. 6 months of shrinking herself smaller and smaller until she barely existed at all. The night she left, she'd found the money. $347,000 in a bag at the back of his closet. She'd stood there for a full minute, staring at it, knowing exactly what it meant. Danny wasn't just mean. Danny was dangerous. The kind of dangerous that came with connections and consequences and people who would follow you across state lines. She'd taken the bag anyway. Not because she wanted the money, but because leaving it felt like leaving part of herself behind. Like admitting she deserved nothing. That was 3 days ago. 3 days of driving. 3 days of watching mirrors. 3 days of pretending she was just a woman moving to a new life instead of a woman running from an old one. The moon finally rose. A sliver of light appeared through the crack in the wall, then grew wider as it climbed. Ella watched it move across the floor, inch by inch, marking time in a way that felt almost peaceful. 10 o'clock. Maybe 11. She'd lost track somewhere around midnight, then found it again, then lost it once more. Her legs had gone numb from sitting so long. She shifted slightly, just enough to restore circulation, and the floorboard beneath her squeaked loud enough to make her freeze. In the silence that followed, she heard something new. Footsteps. Slow and deliberate. Circling the house. Not trying to hide. Not trying to be quiet. Just walking, like someone taking an evening stroll around their own property. Around her property. Around the place she'd bought with stolen money and desperate hope. Ella pressed herself tighter against the wall. Her hand found the knife again. Her breathing went shallow and fast. The footsteps stopped. A long moment of nothing. No sound. No movement. Just the pounding of her heart and the taste of dust still in her mouth. Then a voice. Calm and close. Coming from just outside the wall she was leaning against. "We know you're in there, Ellie." Ellie. Not Ella. The name only one person ever used. The name she tried to leave behind in that apartment with the chipped blue door. Her blood went cold. Her lungs forgot how to work. For one terrible moment, she was back in that apartment, backing away from Dana's raised hand, knowing what was coming and unable to stop it. But she wasn't that woman anymore. She couldn't be. That woman had died somewhere along the highway, somewhere between the Ford and the pickup and the map on the table. The voice outside waited. Patient. Certain. And then, in the darkness of that abandoned homestead, with a knife in her hand and nowhere left to run, Ella finally understood the truth she'd been running from all along. The lie she told herself in part one, the belief that she was just a frightened woman escaping an abusive boyfriend, crumbled like the dust on the floor. Danny wasn't her boyfriend. He was an outlaw. A criminal. A man whose money bought silence and loyalty and people who would follow his orders without question. And she wasn't innocent. She'd taken the money. She'd spent 3 days pretending it was survival instead of theft. She'd told herself 100 stories to avoid the one truth she couldn't face. She was part of this now. Part of his world. Part of the darkness that had followed her across 4 states and ended here, in this room, with a voice calling her by a name she tried to bury. Ella closed her eyes. The knife felt different in her hand now. Not like protection. Like proof. The voice outside spoke again. Softer this time. Almost kind. "We just want what's ours, Ellie. Give it back and we'll go." Another lie. She knew it the same way she knew the moon would keep moving across the floor, the same way she knew morning would come eventually. They wouldn't go. They couldn't. People like them didn't leave witnesses. She opened her eyes and watched the moonlight creep closer. In an hour, maybe 2, it would reach her corner. It would find her sitting there with the knife and the fear and the truth she'd finally admitted. She wasn't running from Danny anymore. She was running from what she'd become because of him. And somewhere outside, in the darkness, they were waiting to remind her. The spit in Ella's mouth had turned thick and sour somewhere in the last hour. She hadn't noticed until now, hadn't had room in her brain for anything except the voice outside and the fear inside. But something had changed. Something she couldn't name yet but could feel building in her chest like pressure before a storm. Her hand on the knife was perfectly still. She noticed that first. The shaking had stopped. Completely. Not the kind of still that comes from exhaustion, but the kind that comes from decision. From knowing what comes next and accepting it. The voice outside hadn't spoken again. Maybe they were waiting for her to answer. Maybe they were circling to the door. Maybe they were just standing there, as still as she was, listening to the silence and wondering what she'd do. Ella pushed herself up from the floor. Her legs complained. Her back ached. Every part of her wanted to sink back down, to curl into a ball, to wait for someone else to solve this. But there was no one else. There hadn't been for a long time. She moved to the window, but not to look out. She'd learned that lesson years ago with Danny. Looking out just showed them where you were. Instead, she pressed her ear to the cold glass and listened. 2 voices. Low and casual, like they weren't standing outside a stranger's house in the middle of the night. Like this was normal. She's just a woman. Scared. She'll give up when the sun comes up. Boss said she's tougher than she looks. Boss ain't here. Ella closed her eyes and let their words wash over her. They thought she was scared. They thought she'd wait for morning, wait for help, wait for something to change. They thought she was the same woman who'd spent 6 months shrinking herself small enough to survive. They were wrong. That woman had died in the last hour, right here on this dusty floor, right when she finally admitted the truth about who she'd become. And something new had taken her place. Something that had been waiting in the shadows all along, just looking for a reason to come out. She crawled away from the window, moving slow and silent across the floorboards. The map lay where she'd dropped it. She picked it up and studied it in the moonlight, not the red line this time, but the terrain around the homestead. The outbuilding. The collapsed windmill. The dry creek bed that curved behind the house. An idea started forming. Dangerous. Crazy. The kind of idea that would have terrified her 12 hours ago. She folded the map and tucked it into her pocket. Then she moved to the front door, the one they'd left open for her, the one that still hung slightly ajar. Through the crack, she could see them. 2 figures standing maybe 30 feet away, half hidden by the shadows of the windmill. One of them was smoking. The orange glow of the cigarette tip moved as he raised it to his mouth, lowered it, raised it again. Waiting. Just like they said. Waiting for morning. Ella took a deep breath. The air tasted like sagebrush and dust and something else she couldn't name. Freedom, maybe. Or the beginning of it. She kicked the door. Hard. Harder than she'd ever kicked anything in her life. It flew open and banged against the wall, loud as a gunshot in the quiet night. The 2 figures outside spun toward the sound, their hands going to their belts, their bodies tensing for action. They expected her to come running out. They expected panic and fear and a woman who didn't know what she was doing. Instead, Ella was already gone. She'd slipped out the back window the second the door hit the wall. The glass had been missing from the frame for years, leaving nothing but open space and a clear path to the ground. She landed hard, her ankle twisting slightly, but she didn't stop to feel the pain. Didn't stop to think. Just kept moving, low and fast, using the darkness like she'd been born in it. The dry creek bed was exactly where the map said it would be. She dropped into it, feeling the cool sand give way under her boots, feeling the walls rise up on either side, hiding her from view. Above her, she heard shouting. Confusion. The sound of 2 men realizing they'd been tricked. She crawled along the creek bed, moving toward the outbuilding she'd seen earlier. It was small, barely bigger than a shed, but it had walls and a roof and a door that closed. More importantly, it had a view of the path between the house and the windmill. The shouting stopped. Then came footsteps, running, circling, searching. They'd figure it out soon. They'd realize she wasn't in the house, wasn't running for the road, wasn't doing anything they expected. But by the time they did, she'd be where they least expected her to go. Right back toward them. The outbuilding's door hung on one hinge. Ella slipped inside and found herself in darkness so complete it felt solid. She stood still for a moment, letting her eyes adjust, letting her breathing slow. Moonlight filtered through cracks in the walls, revealing old tools, rusted farm equipment, a pile of something that might have been hay once. She picked up a length of pipe from the floor. Heavy. Solid. It felt good in her hand, better than the knife somehow. More honest. Through the gaps in the wall, she watched them. They'd split up now, one circling wide around the property, the other heading straight for the creek bed she'd just left. They moved like men who'd done this before. Like men who knew what they were doing. But they didn't know her. They didn't know what she'd learned in 6 months of surviving Danny. They didn't know that fear could be a weapon too, if you aimed it right. The one heading for the creek bed passed within 10 feet of her hiding spot. She could see his face now. Young. Maybe 25. nervous in a way that suggested this wasn't his usual job. He held a flashlight but hadn't turned it on yet, didn't want to give away his position. Ella waited until he passed. Then she slipped out of the outbuilding and followed him. The pipe was cold in her hand. Her heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat. But her feet were silent, her breathing controlled, her mind clear in a way it hadn't been in years. He reached the creek bed and stopped, peering down into the darkness. Looking for her. Looking for the scared woman who'd run and hidden. She came up behind him so quietly that he didn't hear her until she spoke. "You followed the wrong shadow." His head whipped around. His mouth opened to shout. But the pipe was already moving, connecting with his shoulder instead of his head because Ella wasn't a killer, had never been a killer, didn't want to become one now. He went down with a grunt, his flashlight flying into the darkness, his body crumpling into the sand. The shout died in his throat. He looked up at her with eyes that held more surprise than fear. "You're not," he started. "I'm not what?" Ella asked. The pipe hung at her side. Her voice was steady. "I'm not the woman you were expecting." Behind her, a gunshot rang out. So loud it seemed to shake the night itself. The second man, hearing the commotion, had fired wild into the dark. Ella dropped without thinking, hitting the ground just as another shot whistled past her ear. She felt the wind of it, felt how close death had come, felt something shift inside her one more time. The young man on the ground was scrambling for his own weapon. She didn't give him time to find it. She rolled, grabbed the gun from his belt, and came up running toward the house, toward the second man, toward whatever came next. The second shot had given away his position. She could see him now, standing near the windmill, squinting into the darkness, trying to find a target that kept moving. Ella circled wide, using the same creek bed, the same shadows, the same tricks she'd learned from 6 months of hiding in plain sight. When she came up behind him, he was facing the wrong way, still looking toward the house, still waiting for a woman who'd never come out the front door. She pressed the barrel of his partner's gun against his back. "Drop it." He froze. The gun in his hand wavered, then fell to the ground. "Turn around." "Slow." He turned. Older than the other one. 40s maybe. Hard eyes that had seen too much. He looked at her not with fear but with something like respect. "You're not what I expected," he said. "I know," Ella said. "I'm not what I expected either." Behind her, somewhere in the darkness, she heard the first man groaning, starting to move. In front of her, this man stood waiting, watching, wondering what she'd do next. The gun felt heavy in her hand. The night felt cold on her skin. And somewhere in the distance, she heard something new. Sirens. Faint at first, then growing louder. Coming closer. Someone had heard the shots. Someone had called for help. The man in front of her heard them too. His eyes flickered toward the sound, then back to her. "This doesn't have to end bad," he said. Ella looked at him. Looked at the gun in her hand. Looked at the darkness that had followed her for 3 days and 3 nights. "It already ended," she said. "You just don't know it yet." The sirens grew louder. Red and blue lights started painting the horizon. And Ella kept standing there, holding the gun, waiting for whatever came next. Dawn broke over the homestead like a promise Ella hadn't asked for but was receiving anyway. The first light crept across the sky, soft and pink and impossibly gentle after everything the night had held. It painted the world in colors that didn't seem real. Peach and lavender and gold at the edges. The light found the chipped blue door first. The one that had been hanging open for hours, swinging in the night wind, marking the entrance to a house that had seen better days. But the door wasn't hanging anymore. It lay flat on the ground now, pulled from its hinges and laid out like a welcome mat. On top of it sat 2 men. Hands tied behind their backs with rope Ella had found in the outbuilding. Unconscious but breathing. The younger one's shoulder where she'd hit him with the pipe was already starting to swell. The older one just looked tired, like he'd finally stopped running from something too. Ella stood over them, the brass doorknob heavy in her hand. She'd picked it up without thinking, some instinct telling her to hold onto it, to keep one piece of this place she'd traveled so far to find. The metal was cold against her palm, just like it had been 3 days ago when she'd locked her apartment door for the last time. But everything else was different. Her clothes were torn. A long rip ran down the left sleeve of her jacket, caught on something during the night's chaos. Her face was streaked with dirt and dust and the faint line of dried blood from where that bullet had come so close to ending everything. She could feel it when she moved, a tightness on her cheek where the air had burned past. But she wasn't shaking. That was the strangest part. After hours of trembling so hard she could barely stand, her hands were perfectly still. The adrenaline had burned away completely, leaving something else in its place. Something that felt almost like peace. The sirens had stopped maybe 20 minutes ago. The first police car had arrived while she was still holding the gun, still facing down the older man, still trying to figure out what came next. 2 more had followed. Then an ambulance. Then a sheriff's car with lights that painted the whole homestead red and blue. She'd dropped the gun when they told her to. Raised her hands. Walked toward them with her heart pounding but her feet steady. She'd explained everything, or as much as she could explain, while paramedics checked her for injuries and officers hauled the 2 men into the back of a cruiser. The younger one had woken up by then. He'd looked at her with something like wonder, like he couldn't quite believe she was real. Now, in the dawn light, Ella was alone. The police had taken statements and evidence and the 2 men who'd followed her across 4 states. They'd told her to stay put, that someone would be back to talk to her again, that everything was going to be okay. She'd nodded and watched them drive away, their taillights disappearing down the dirt road she'd arrived on just yesterday. That felt like a lifetime ago. Maybe it was. She walked to the edge of the property and looked out at the land stretching before her. Miles of nothing. Miles of possibility. The collapsed windmill stood to her left, its broken blades catching the morning light. The outbuilding sat to her right, looking less scary now that she knew what was inside. Rusty tools and old hay and a length of pipe that had saved her life. The house itself waited behind her. Still standing. Still weathered. Still hers, technically, even though she'd never signed a single paper or paid a single dollar. The real estate agent would probably have questions. The bank would probably want explanations. But all of that could wait. Right now, all that existed was this moment. This dawn. This silence that felt more like healing than emptiness. Ella looked down at the doorknob in her hand. Such a small thing to carry so much weight. She'd held it 3 days ago, pressing her forehead against that chipped blue door in the city, feeling the vibration that had warned her something was wrong. She'd held it again last night, in the darkness of this very different place, using it to steady herself when the fear got too big to contain. Now it was just a piece of metal. Just a souvenir from a life she'd left behind. She walked back toward the house, toward the door that lay flat on the ground, toward the 2 men who were starting to stir. The younger one opened his eyes as she approached. He blinked up at her, confused, then remembered where he was and why. "You're still here," he said. His voice was rough with sleep and defeat. "I am," Ella said. "Why?" She thought about it. Thought about all the reasons she could have run. All the roads she could have taken. All the ways she could have disappeared into the world and never looked back. "Because I'm done running," she said finally. "Someone has to answer for what happened. Might as well be me." The younger man stared at her for a long moment. Then he looked away, toward the horizon where the sun was climbing higher, turning the sky from pink to gold to the blue of a regular day. In the distance, another cloud of dust appeared on the dirt road. Coming closer. Probably the sheriff, back with more questions. Or maybe a social worker. Or maybe just someone responding to a call about 2 men tied to a door in the middle of nowhere. Ella walked to the edge of the property and waited. The doorknob was still in her hand. She looked at it one last time, remembering the apartment, the Ford, the highway, the fear. Remembering the woman she'd been and the woman she'd become. Then she dropped it. The brass hit the dirt with a soft thud. A small puff of dust rose around it, then settled. It lay there in the morning light, just another piece of metal in a world full of metal, just another object in a landscape that didn't care about objects. But Ella cared. She cared because letting it go meant something. It meant she wasn't holding onto the past anymore. It meant she was walking forward with empty hands and an open heart, ready for whatever came next. The vehicle got closer. She could see it now, a sheriff's department SUV, kicking up dust as it bounced along the rutted road. It would arrive in a minute or two. There would be questions and forms and probably a ride back to town. There would be explanations and investigations and a long road ahead. But for this one moment, Ella stood in the dawn light of her homestead, breathing air that smelled like sage and possibility, and felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Not the desperate kind that comes from running away. Not the fragile kind that breaks at the first sign of trouble. The real kind. The kind that grows in the space after survival, when you realize you're still standing and the sun is still rising and the world is still full of chances. The SUV pulled up and stopped. A woman in uniform got out, her face kind but professional. She looked at Ella, then at the house, then at the two men on the door. "You must have quite a story," she said. Ella smiled. It felt strange on her face, like a muscle she hadn't used in years. But it also felt right. "I do," she said. "But I think the best parts are still ahead." The sheriff's deputy nodded like she understood. Maybe she did. Maybe everyone understood what it felt like to reach the end of one road and find another waiting. Together, they walked toward the house. Toward the men who'd followed her. Toward the questions and answers and whatever justice looked like in a place like this. Ella didn't look back at the doorknob lying in the dirt. She didn't need to. It would still be there if she ever came looking for it. A reminder of where she'd been and how far she'd come. But right now, she was too busy walking forward. Too busy watching the sun climb higher. Too busy being alive in a world that, for the first time in a long time, felt like it might actually be on her side. The homestead waited. The future waited. And Ella walked toward both of them with steady feet and an open heart, ready for whatever came next.